Limsa Lominsa is arguably the most popular city-state in the world of Final Fantasy XIV, and you can see why. It has sprawling streets overlooking the sea, access to almost every major continent or region via a boat or an aetheryte. It has a great musical score, and well, I mean, like, the market board and like the summoning bell are like 2 seconds away from the aetheryte, so it's like more efficient for like those who want to like min-max their playtime, which is like probably like 90% of the people that like AFK in the tiny plaza, and so they like go here to specifically min-max that. And I mean there is more to Limsa, of course, than just ease of access for a min-maxing omnicrafter. For Limsa is a city ruled by pirates for pirates, and has been since it was founded by men fleeing the corruption of kings and queens dating back centuries ago. Its history is long and spans the last known age, well before the world of Hydaelyn or Atheris or Final Fantasy XIV, if you want to be technical, was free for us to explore. And so today, we shall review the lore and history of Eorzea's very own Nassau, and how a bunch of pirates managed to create a nation. In the year 874 of the 6th Astral Era, over 700 years before the Battle of Cartano and A Realm Reborn, a crew of a ship known as the Gladion, the last vessel of a mighty armada, sailed south across the seas of the Northern Empty above mainland Aldenard. Hailing from a land or nation known as Aercelint, the Gladion's crew were mostly sea wolves, a brutal clan comprised of Rogadin that were hailed as the terror of the seas west of what would be Eorzea. And this specific crew of sea wolves, they were captained by one of their own, an Admiral Elowain. Among these sea wolves, however, there were 2 Elysian helmsmen, which helmsman is the moniker for those who pilot a ship. Both of them went by the names of Jean de Neville and Guy La Thagran. They also had a loadsman, which means navigator, possibly another Elysian, given his name. Historic accounts don't really say, but I'll talk on him a tad more in just a bit. It would be aboard the Gladion that both Sea Wolf and these couple Elysian alike sailed south, away from the tyranny of the Northern Isles. What was happening on the Northern Isles, we don't really know. All we really know is that the Gladion had attempted a coup against the reigning rulers and failed, thus why it fled. And this voyage that the Gladion took to the south, it lasted just over a year, and ended only when they ran aground on another isle. This one far more tropical and far and away from the troubles back home. This was the Isle of Vilbrand, a large volcanic island off the coast of Eorzea, separated from the mainland by the Strait of Merle Thor, and by claim of the Gladion's 2 helmsmen, with support of their admiral. This island would be the crew's new home, and a village would soon sprout upon its southern shores. Alas, the journey to these shores were not without its trials, tribulations, nor without casualty. For you see, that fabled loadsman I mentioned earlier, he perished from scurvy but 2 days before landfall. And so, for his service to the crew, for navigating them upon unknown waters, upon the ground where the Gladion's crew built their first home, the surrounding land would be named and dedicated to the loadsman's honor and sacrifice on the high seas. This site, as well as all regions in Vilbrand, would come to be known as Noscea, which remains their name to this day. But regardless of its name and where it came from, this island was anything but peaceful for the pirates, for not long after their arrival, the crew of the Gladion were assailed by the island's native inhabitants, the kobolds, badger-like beastmen that did not take too kindly to sharing their lands with another. And so, without the proper means to truly defend themselves against the overwhelming number of kobolds, the crew of the Gladion were forced back to sea and away from their village. But not all was lost, for Close to where the ship had anchored, there were several large, some were small, islands that made this tiny key in the Bay of Vilbrand's southern coast. And so, from the Galadion and its hull, bridges would be built between these islands, both big and small, as well as the reefs that dotted around them, and they made a home on the water. And thus it would be in the year 875 that the city of Limsa Lominsa was officially born, a testament to the crew's willingness to not give up on their new home so easily, for they would exist until, as the city-state's motto would come to be, they would exist until all had failed and sea swallowed all. Now, in a fairy tale, for some cultures, some towns, villas, or villages, such a will to survive would often be paid with growth and prosperity and power, much like Garlemald or Ulda, for example. But this is not Ilsabard, nor are we in Thanalan, because in the early days of Limsa's founding, it was a struggle for its residents to just survive. The shoddy plateaus and bridges making up its streets, the carved out caves that housed its people, they all became a place for coinless refugees, no different than what was found in the northern territories that the Galadion escaped from. And there was no easy way to immediately remedy their fortunes either, for their fortunes would have had to have relied upon the rich earth of mainland Vilbrand, which was guarded almost religiously by the same kobolds who booted the original refugees back to sea. And any attempts to colonize or defend their holdings on Noscea were met with massacre after massacre by the kobold tribes. One such massacre occurred in what would be western Noscea in the year 879, which saw an entire village wiped out by the kobold tribes. This massacre then prompted a response by the early Lominsans in the next year that saw another massacre take place in what is now known as Skull Valley, one of the only defensible positions that the pirates had. And it was really only kept safe because the refugees were lining the valley with skulls and basically warding off any daring kobolds attempting to slaughter more of these foreign settlers, hence the name Skull Valley. To make matters worse, only 20 or so years after the nation's founding, its leader, the Admiral of the Galadion, Elowain, he would die at the age of 76 to an unknown disease, which historical accounts have attributed to lung rot, developed due to Limsa's horrible living conditions. And so, with Elowain's dying breath, Trager the Cold, another Rogadin, was named as his successor, which began the tradition of each admiral choosing who shall succeed them upon death, and this decision also left Trager to pick up Elowain's pieces and save Limsa Lominsa. And so Trager concluded, to keep Limsa afloat, those who settled Vilbrand, they could not look to shore. They physically could not unless they risked nothing but death. So they needed to instead look out to sea. For while many of those who found themselves in Limsa were poor, it was true, with not a gill to their name, many among them were also privateers once upon a time, sailors that had never forgotten how to sail or how to wage war upon water. And so a plan was formed. To survive, the Lominsans would have to take, and they would have to take it by force, through piracy. Though, with their one and only ship, the Galadion, decommissioned to serve as a home upon Limsa's atoll, new ships would be needed. So, by Trager's order, the earliest Lominsans, with little left to lose, would all come together and form the Knights of the Barracuda, Navy to the city-state, and also the Yellow Jackets, the Army to the city-state, and then they returned to Vilbrand in droves and claimed for themselves the few scant forests that dotted the isle from the kobolds. From these trees, from the lumber acquired, would warships be constructed at newly minted places like the Morabee dry docks, and later these ships would be used to pillage and pirate any merchant vessels that dared sail through the western seas, which was many and more. And eventually, From squalor and strife, from massacre and struggle, Limsa Lominsa's fortunes would turn, and they would grow fat off of plunder and booty. A black market would be established in the city to peddle the stolen goods, and their population would swell with new recruits captured from these merchant vessels they were raiding, and or those arriving onto shores from afar with the promise of cheap goods, untapped markets, and raw opportunity. Before long, the sea wolves that founded the nation worked alongside those like the plainsfolk Lalafell from the Southern Isles, both mid and highlanders from mainland Eorzea, and also a sum of Makote belonging to the Seekers of the Sun. It was a clear sign that Limsa was prospering, but such prosperity might soon spell doom for the city as a whole. By around the year 930, the pirates of Limsa Lominsa had grown quite powerful. So powerful, in fact, that they had been deemed a threat to most other nations looking to sail through places like the Rotano Sea, and measures to keep their cargo safe were taken. Around this time, there was a large swell in increased security measures for most open sea traversal. Those like the newly established Ul'dah out in Thanalan would begin placing armed gunships around all of their convoys, aimed at deterring the pirates from attacking them. But instead of acting as a deterrent, like they were supposed to, better protected cargo and loot just ended up leading to the creation of larger pirate crews, bigger gangs, and then alliances being established between all of them that would then go on and contest any ships traveling the sea, which just so happened to include each other. Soon enough, as time went on, lines would be drawn between these different pirate crews, territory would be established, and an age of ceaseless quarrels between many of these crews would begin in the 940th year of the 6th Astral Era. And these quarrels would stem from conflicts involving maritime actions, territory of the different crews, and equal or unequal shares of loot. And these were not just peaceful discussions either. They were violent. Very, very violent. Violence and gain were really the only language most pirates in Limsa spoke at this point. So gains were met with violence. Violence concluded with making gains, which then led to violence, which then led to gains, etc., etc. Essentially, Limsa Lominsa had basically entered into a civil war. But it wasn't over the state, so the admiralty that reigned was basically powerless to stop it, despite the fact that the constant infighting was deteriorating life on all of Vilbrand. And so, for the next 2 decades of Limsa's history, the streets and seas around Vilbrand would be bathed in blood of both the innocent and the guilty. Many crews during this time would rise, and many would fall. And the city-state was anything but a free port to the misfortunate or the opportunists. Eventually, though, the current admiral of the age, whether that still be Traeger the Cold or another, this historical accounts don't really say, they were assassinated in the year 963, 23 years after the conflict began, and they were replaced by another that would come in and usher in a lasting change. This new admiral was named Agatgar, a buccaneer during his heyday, and now admiral in one of the most tumultuous times in Lominsan history. But he did not sit idle like other admirals, lording over the city that was currently being soaked in blood. Agatgar instead recognized that the city would not last if nothing changed. Thus did he bring in the strongest of Limsa's crews that were fighting one another to the negotiation table in order to sue for a peace that would be obtained in the usual Lominsan fashion at the time, which was barters, deals, and general threats to the opposite side's well-being. But lo and behold, it worked. From this meeting, an oath, a code of conduct, a terms of service, if you will, was secured by the pirates that attended the meeting, an oath that would go on to be followed by all crews to sail under the Lominsan flag. This oath this terms of service. It was short, simple, and sweet. No crew will cheat another of its plunder, nor rob a fellow Lominsan, nor sell your fellow man into slavery. It was a simple rule, but nonetheless effective. For many of the larger crews in the city, who were weary of warfare at this point, they took to the oath like a fly on excrement and began to treat it as if it were the word of Limlane herself. In fact, so great would Agatgar's oath be held in regard that it would go on to spawn its own shadowy organization known as the Upright Thieves, who would be formed from the best of Limsa's crews and would keep watch on the populace of Limsa Lominsa to ensure that the rule put into place stayed in place. Any who dared defy the code were punished, and they were made to be an example for others, for no man, and I mean no one, not even the Admiral, was above the pirate code. Every tavern, every alley, every nook and cranny of Limsa Lominsa would be subservient to the rule because the rule followed the crews. And so it would be by Agatgar's code and the policing by the Upright Thieves that a simple rule aimed at stopping bloodshed would become the nation's law, but not by will of the Admiralty, but by the blood and sweat of the everyday pirate. And thanks to this, Limsa Lominsa would return to peace in the year 966. But a secured future is not all Agatgar did for his city. He would also expand the role of the Admiralty substantially, implementing taxes on traded plunder and tariffs on traded goods, richening the city-state as a whole. With this new wealth, the infamous Knights of the Barracuda, as well as the Yellowjackets, would be bolstered and used to secure the city's interests on mainland Vilbrand, pushing the kobolds from the shores back to Mount Orgomoro. And seeing how strong the nation had become over the years, the kobolds had all but ceased hostilities with the Lominsans, so long as they were allowed to live beneath their sacred mountain in peace. And then 10 years following the peace with the kobolds, Agatgar would go and reform the Lominsan black market and open it for public use. This would allow for the civilians and pirates of Lominsa to sell both their trade goods and pirated goods equally. And this great change in the economy would go on to spawn in another influx of immigrants from around Eorzea and the rest of the world. And finally, as his last rule of law, before he sat down his mantle as admiral, to ensure that blood will never be spilt in the way it was before, and Limsa sees a peaceful transfer of power between its admirals, Agatgar announced and declared that a competition between the strongest of Limsa's crews would be held at the end of his reign in the year 992. It is by the Admiral's decree that every 7 years, the strongest crews of Limsa would be pitted against one another in a multi-pronged race that would determine who shall be elevated to the seat of Admiral in the High Tower, with whosoever claims first place as the victor. This competition would come to be known as the Trident, and it would be this competition that would see Limsa through the decades and ages following Agatgar's reign, with fair or ill admirals serving a term of 7 years before being beaten in the Trident or winning again. And even for the suitors that didn't claim victory in the Trident, well, there was always next time. And such hope and spirit, hope of winning again one day, as well as the rough ways that some admirals chose to rule, Limsa would find itself united in the spirit and rush of competition, and to be the very best, all without pillaging the city. Thus, by Agatgar's will and policy, Limsa Lominsa prospered again. Of course, there is more to say on Limsa Lominsa, but such will need to wait for now. So if you enjoyed this video, and you would like to see more, including part 2 to the history of Limsa Lominsa, please be sure to like, subscribe, and comment to save me from the algorithm gods. Thanks for watching, and I will see you all real soon.